Hey there, friends. Pardon the weird light. I have sort of a rainy day in front of me, and the lighting isn't ideal. But I got a really interesting question, and I just wanted to share my thoughts on the answer. Again, sort of March of the Pips related. The question was, what's the difference between a pip deck and a Marseille deck? And I thought I would take that a little further even and talk about what the difference between a pip deck was and a Marseille deck and the Rider-Waite-Smith system. So this is not a comparison in terms of like features and benefits. It's just sort of like, here's how I define the bunch, here's sort of what they mean when I refer to them that way. So there are a few caveats. One is that there's many systems, and I obviously could make a very long video about all of them. What I'm not sort of covering here are things like the Crowley-Thoth system, and like Minchiati decks and such. The other thing I guess that I could have done and didn't, well, I guess I can still do it. Whoops. So, Tarot, it was a really old game, and the first sort of complete decks are Italian, as far as we know. And this is a very early Italian deck on which, eventually, over time, the Marseille Tarot came to be. So this is a pip deck, and what I mean when I talk about a pip deck is a deck that does not have pictures that depict situations. I call them situational pips or situational minors. So all of the number cards just show a number of a suit. So this is the Visconti Sforza, a recreation of it, which is an old Italian deck and sort of one of the first nearly complete tarots. This deck is not complete. There were a few cards recreated for this edition, and different editions have had different artists recreate them in different styles. But this is sort of, held in general to be one of the first sort of tarot decks as we know tarot today. And so then over time things evolved and changed, and if you want a really good overview of the history of tarot and its sort of development with a basis in history, I can really recommend Robert M. Place's book, his new book, The Tarot, Magic, Alchemy, Hermeticism, and Neoplatonism. I'm not done reading it. It's a tome, but there's a good, solid sort of history of how tarot got from where it started to where it is today. So then we jump from Italy to France, and we get the Marseille deck. All right, so what I did was I just pulled some examples of Marseille decks. I'm just sort of checking the light as we go through this. So this is one of the earliest. It may be the earliest. It's a recreation, of course, because the older, reproductions look like, they're aged. And this is sort of a recreation of it. So this is the Jean Noblet Tarot de Marseille. And you can see that it has a very specific look to it. They look very much like playing cards in their way. They're very blocky, simple colors, because they were originally done as woodblock prints. And the minors, the suits, are all, again, sort of non-situational. They don't tell a story with a picture. And to be a Marseille deck for Marseille purists, essentially you need to sort of follow that pattern pretty closely. So when we say a Marseille deck, what we're talking about is something like this. Another recreation that I'm really fond of is the Conver Bendov, the CBD Tarot. This was a recreation of a later and probably the most influential Marseille deck, the Conver Tarot de Marseille. But again, though the cards are a different size and shape, and though colors will vary from edition to edition, you're getting this. They're very similar in sort of format, and so that's what a Marseille deck is. If you're sort of a purist, right? Like that's a Marseille style. It's not Marseille style. I'm going to talk about Marseille style in a sec. That's a Marseille deck. And then I would also class sort of modern versions into it because they while they don't sort of use the same printing techniques, the structure and art style and the depiction is still very similar. This is the Marshmallow Marseille, and it's modern, it's new, but the structure, the design, is very, very in line with Marseille. So I would consider this a Marseille in the Marseille tradition, even though it didn't, and the Marseille decks are kind of a misnomer because not all Marseille decks came from Marseille, and they were printed all over the world. But it's a name. So in order to be like a straight up Marseille deck, you sort of have to sort of follow pretty closely to that style, especially for purists. And I'm not using that term in a pejorative way. I mean it for people really care about this stuff. And I should say a purist probably would even question my inclusion of this because the coloration of the earlier decks, of the decks that are either recreations of or reproductions of Marseille decks from the period of the 16th, 17th, 18th century, probably 17th and 18th century, if I remember correctly. The coloration is very specific. It's very simple. It's very straightforward. And there are schools of reading where all of that matters a lot. To me, it doesn't. So I would class these. I would include Le Tarot Noir, which is on the shelf behind me, in that category too, because they follow the pattern, even if the coloration is different. In the same way that, I'll talk about Rider-Waite-Smith in a second, I would consider decks Rider-Waite-Smith decks, even if they don't necessarily hew exactly to the coloration and, line drawings, etc. So that's what Marseille is. Now there's something you can add to the puzzle called Marseille-style. And examples of that I would include the new Seventh Sphere, it's called a Tarot de Marseille, as well as Triomphe della Luna. Now these are both very, very closely aligned to Marseille-style decks, or to Marseille decks, but they're Marseille-style, meaning that they have very similar pips, but the structure and look of the trumps are a bit different. They made, this Fool is very, very influenced by modern identifications of the Fool, which, in a Marseille deck would be far more, I'm not going to be able to find him, am I? Far more foolish, you know what I mean? In a Marseille deck, he's depicted as, a wanderer or a fool, an idiot, you know what I mean? A hobo, that's sort of classist, right? But those things are, again, sort of the period. I'm not going to find him because that's always how this works. And I wanted to keep this short. Oh, there he is. So, you get in this Fool sort of less, esoteric. You get a much more sort of mystical journey here. So again, this is a deck that's influenced by Marseille, but it's also influenced by other systems. So I would call this Marseille-style. Likewise, the Triomphe della Luna, which is probably a little closer systematically. But, again, it's sort of a riff on the Marseille. But it adheres pretty closely. But again, yeah, you could debate, but I feel like this is a Marseille-style deck. Another Marseille-style deck that I really like is the Piatnik Wien or the Pointner deck. So this is Marseille-style in that many of the suits are similar to Marseille, but they're not. The swords are very different. The trumps and the courts are very different. But coins and cups are very much like the Marseille. Wands are different. So it's in the tradition of, but it's not a straight up TDM. So these are examples of cards that are Marseille style. Then we get into the question of what's a pip deck, and essentially a pip deck is any deck that is not made using situational pips or pips that have pictures of people doing things. So just to sort of talk about what a situational pip deck would be, the Rider-Waite-Smith is the classic example, right? Because Rather than 4 coins, you've got a man, engaging with 4 coins. You have someone engaging with 5 swords. So again, this is what I would call, sometimes they're called scenic. People argue that all cards are scenic. Some say these are illustrated. Some would argue that all cards are illustrated. To me, they're situational because they're depicting a situation. They're like an event occurring. Whether the event is realistic or not. So that's what I would say is like a non-pip deck. So a pip deck is basically anything that does not have minor cards that look like this. So this is the Rider-Waite-Smith system, and there are, of course, modern iterations of that. This is the Shadowscapes, which is very much in line with Rider-Waite-Smith, and you can see, again, the pips, like the 9 of Cups here. This may not have been the best example to pull, but you can see someone engaging with the suits, engaging in a situation that depicts the 6 of Swords. And another example of that is, this is an interesting one, and I pulled this because it kind of lives in between both worlds. This is the Sheridan Douglas, and it sort of has some cards that are pip-like. So I would consider that sort of a pip card. But then this is much more Rider-Waite-Smith because it's a situational thing happening. So this is an interesting deck, but it sort of is not, it lives in between. Other examples of pip decks I pulled, this is the Arcana playing cards. This is probably a really good example of a pip deck because the pips, again, are literally playing cards. They have the card suit, like hearts and cups on both, so it's a nice, easy way to remember if you're not used to sort of making that association. But this is a pip deck, but it's not a Marseille deck because, again, it doesn't follow that look, that system, that style. I pulled also, again, this is another of my favorites. The Corte dei Tarocchi. This is another card deck that it's a pip deck, but it's not Marseille. So there's 3 swords, but they're not in the Marseille style. There's 6 cups. Do you see what I mean? So that's what a pip deck would be. And then I pull, again, there are some that live in between. So I would consider the Sheridan Douglas one that lives in between. The Tildwick is one that I pulled because it could easily sort of live in between because its minors are so... This is a deck I love and have a hard time with, but like here's the 7 of Coins. What you don't see is a picture of someone interacting with 7 coins. If you're close enough, you can see the 7 coins there, but you have this sort of very foggy view of a fountain. This 10 of Stabs here has like an axe and you see wood, but you don't have it's a very sort of like in-between deck. So again, that's sort of an interesting example of something that lives in between. And then finally I pulled out a Robert M. Place deck. This is Tarot of the Sevenfold Mystery. And I pulled this one out because it, again, is one that he kind of lives in between both worlds with his minors in a lot of his decks. Because, for example, here, you have like an image of a scene, but then here you have something far more pip-like. Here, this is a little bit of an image and a little bit of a pip. And even in some of his theme decks, like the Buddha Tarot, I should have grabbed that one, or the Vampire Tarot, he actually will have a small scene at the bottom and the pip orientation at the top. So you kind of get sort of the best of both worlds, I guess. So anyway, I just wanted to sort of share that. I've made a big mess, haven't I? So just to recap, quickly, a Marseille deck is in this art style, either drawn from or reproduced of the cards from that era, or at least sort of very, very closely inspired by it. A Marseille style deck is sort of inspired by that style, but takes a lot of liberties, like these two. And then a pip deck would be really anything that does not have Rider-Waite-Smith inspired or really sort of scenic situations on the minors. So these are examples of non-pip decks. So in essence, a pip deck is any deck, whether it be sort of playing card style or a tarot card that does not have people interacting with scenes. And then there are some hybrids that kind of live in between. You know, and these are, I think the Wild Unknown is an example of that. Certainly the Robert and Place decks that I mentioned are examples of that. And those are nice transitions. I think the Wild Unknown was a big transition for me, because it made me start to realize, like, when I first started learning to read this way, I didn't have the relationship to the numbers that I do now. So I would look at the energy of the card on the Wild Unknown and sort of recall the Waite Smith picture and sort of work with those things to create a meaning. And it made me start to realize, like, oh, I didn't need the picture. You know, you could read with a deck of cards that has the name of the card on it. It's just all about sort of the preference and the style. And as I always say, one reason I really like reading with pip decks is because, you know, the Two of Coins actually I think is a really nice depiction of my relationship to two in tarot. But you know, when you're sort of looking at, this is gonna be all majors, right? You know, it's hard to sort of see anything other than sort of collaboration there. You know what I mean? So again, like, that's just a personal preference thing, but I think that that can be a beautiful experience too. It's just sort of like the preference of the person and the time and the reading. But so again, that's sort of a look at like what the difference between Marseille and pip decks are, and sort of what pip decks are different from Rider-Waite Smith or situational pip. So for some folks, this is old information, but if it was new to you, I hope it was helpful. Have a good day.